If I told you that a world war that killed 10 million people started because a driver made a wrong turn, would you believe me? We're about to dive deep into the iceberg of history's butterfly effects caused by human error. And trust me, they get darker and darker. Tier 1. The surface. Famous technological and human errors. The wrong turn that started a world war coincidence. History can be a dark comedy, and its punchline is often a ridiculous, almost unbelievable coincidence. The stage is Sarajevo, June 28th, 1914. The air is thick with the simmering hatred of Serbian nationalists for the Austro-Hungarian Empire that occupies their land. The date itself, the Davdan, is a sacred Serbian holiday, a memorial to a historic battle, scheduling a military parade for the Austrian heir, Archduke Franz Ferdinand. On this day wasn't just poor planning, it was a profound and intolerable insult. The plot to kill him was orchestrated by the Black Hand, a secret society with deep ties to the Serbian army, who recruited and armed a group of peasant students known as the Young Bosnians. The initial assassination attempt was a spectacular failure. The security was a joke, only 20 local policemen for a 4-mile route that had been published in advance. At 10:15 a.m., an assassin named Nedeljko Čobranović threw a bomb. It bounced off the Archduke's folded-back convertible roof and exploded under the next car, wounding 2 officers. The Archduke was unharmed. In the ensuing chaos, the motorcade sped away, and Čobranović's cyanide pill was so old it only made him vomit before he was arrested. The other assassins, including Gavrilo Princip, lost their nerve and failed to act. The plot was dead. But then came the Archduke's stubbornness. After a speech at City Hall, he made a fateful, unscripted decision. He insisted on visiting the wounded officers in the hospital. This required a change of route. An official decision was made to travel straight down the Opelka to avoid the city center. In a catastrophic oversight, this crucial change was never communicated to the Archduke's driver. Following the original, now obsolete route, the driver made a right turn onto Franz Josef Street. An official in the car, General Potiorek, screamed, "This is the wrong way." The startled driver slammed on the brakes, and the engine of the Greifenschiff vehicle stalled. The car was a stationary, open-topped target. By a sheer, tragic coincidence, so perfect it feels scripted, the spot where the car stalled was directly in front of Schiller's Delicatessen. Standing on that exact corner, dejected after the morning's failure, was the 19-year-old Gavrilo Princip. Fate had just delivered his target to him. Motionless, 5 feet away, he stepped forward and fired 2 shots. Within minutes, the Archduke and his wife were dead. Exactly 1 month later, after a series of ultimatums and mobilizing alliances, the great powers of Europe were at war. 10 million people would die. A world was shattered, not by a brilliant plan, but by an improbable cascade of errors. Lax security, a bungled first attempt, a stubborn Archduke, a communication failure, a stalled car, and the final, unbelievable coincidence of a dejected assassin being in the right place at the right time. The radio play that caused a national panic illusion. October 30, 1938, the night before Halloween, in a CBS radio studio, a 23-year-old theatrical prodigy named Orson Welles was about to conduct one of history's most significant, if unintentional, psychological experiments. His weekly show, The Mercury Theater on the Air, was adapting H.G. Wells's 40-year-old science fiction novel, The War of the Worlds. Wells's collaborators thought the story was silly and improbable, fearing it would be laughed off the air. To make it halfway believable, they made a series of ingenious creative choices that succeeded beyond their wildest dreams. The genius of the broadcast lay in its innovative structure. Welles and his writer, Howard Koch, reframed the narrative, transplanting the setting from 1890s England to contemporary New Jersey. They structured the first half of the show as a series of increasingly frantic, simulated live news bulletins that interrupted a program of ordinary dance music. The crucial error, or perhaps the masterstroke, was in the timing. A significant number of listeners were tuned to a more popular comedy show on the rival NBC network. When that show's comedy sketch ended and a musical guest began, millions of listeners switched their dials to CBS, completely missing the opening announcement that the program was a work of fiction. They tuned into a media landscape they had been conditioned to trust implicitly, at a time of immense global anxiety with the threat of war in Europe looming large. What they heard was the sound of their world ending. The broadcast realism was terrifyingly effective. Wells deliberately delayed the first commercial break for nearly 40 minutes. A key detail because audiences knew that real unfolding news coverage didn't pause for ads. An actor famous for his pitch-perfect impression of President Roosevelt played the Secretary of the Interior, lending an air of official authority. The most chilling segment featured a reporter live from Grover's Mill, New Jersey, whose escalating panic was modeled directly on the real-life broadcast of the Hindenburg disaster, culminating in the audio feed being abruptly cut, implying he had been vaporized on air. The ripple effect was a wave of panic. Thousands of terrified citizens flooded telephone switchboards, calling police and newspapers to ask if the reports were real. In New Jersey, families reportedly packed their belongings and fled their homes, convinced poison gas was drifting their way. In Concrete, Washington, a coincidental power outage plunged the town into darkness at the height of the broadcast, leading to genuine fear. The next day, newspapers, eager to discredit their new rival, radio, seized on the story, splashing headlines of den-wide hysteria across their front pages, cementing the legend. Wells, in a masterful performance, apologized profusely at a press conference, but the incident catapulted him to national fame. The broadcast was a powerful demonstration of how reality is, to a large extent, a story we agree upon, and how easily that story can be changed by altering the broadcast. The hard drive worth $500 million fortune. This is a uniquely modern fable, a story of a colossal fortune lost to a moment of mundane carelessness. It begins in 2009 in the nascent days of cryptocurrency, when Bitcoin was an obscure curiosity for a small community of tech enthusiasts, with each coin valued at virtually nothing. During this period, James Howells, an IT engineer from Newport, Wales, used his Dell laptop to mine a digital wallet containing what was later reported to be between 7,500 and 8,000 bitcoins. He saved the essential cryptographic private keys onto the laptop's hard drive, and when the laptop was later damaged, he tossed the crucial hard drive into a desk drawer and largely forgot about it. The critical error occurred 4 years later, in the summer of 2013. House was conducting a routine office cleanup. In his drawer lay 2 identical laptop hard drives. One was blank and useless. The other contained the keys to his digital kingdom. He accidentally placed the wrong one into a black rubbish bag, which was subsequently taken to the Docksway landfill site. At the time it was thrown away, the coins were already worth a substantial £500,000. Within months, their value surged to £4 million. The hard drive was now buried under tons of municipal waste. The ripple effect was a slow, agonizing dawning of the magnitude of the mistake. As Bitcoin's value skyrocketed, the discarded piece of electronic junk transformed into a legendary digital treasure chest, worth over $500 million at its peak. For more than a decade, Howells has been locked in a bizarre battle with the Newport City Council, repeatedly petitioning them for permission to excavate the landfill. The council has consistently denied his requests, citing enormous costs, environmental risks, and the logistical nightmare of finding a needle in a 200,000-ton haystack. Howells assembled a team of specialists, including a data recovery expert from the Space Shuttle Challenger disaster, proposed an $11 million operation using AI scanners and robotic dogs. He offered the city 25% of the recovered fortune. The council remained unmoved. In January 2025, a judge ruled that his claim had no realistic prospect of succeeding, effectively ending his quest. The buried hard drive thus serves as a powerful symbol of a modern conflict, a fortune of almost unimaginable worth rendered inaccessible by a mountain of garbage and bureaucracy. The mix-up that obliterated a Mars lander hubris. On December 11, 1998, NASA launched the Mars Climate Orbiter, a $125 million probe designed to be the first interplanetary weather satellite. It was a high-profile collaboration between two teams, Lockheed Martin in Denver, who built the spacecraft, and NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory, JPL, in California, who handled the navigation. This organizational separation, with its reliance on perfect communication, would prove to be the mission's fatal flaw. The loss of the orbiter was caused by a deceptively simple human error. A piece of ground software developed by Lockheed Martin calculated the impulse produced by the probe's thrusters using the English unit of pound-force seconds. However, the navigation software used by JPL was programmed to receive this data in the metric unit of Newton seconds, a requirement explicitly laid out in the mission's official specifications. 1 pound force is equivalent to 4.45 newtons. This meant that every time Lockheed's software sent a value, JPL's navigation software interpreted it as being 4.45 times smaller than it actually was. This fundamental mismatch went undetected for the entire 9.5-month journey. With every small thruster firing, the orbiter was nudged slightly but decisively off its intended path, pushed relentlessly, and fatally closer to Mars than anyone realized. Disturbingly, at least 2 navigators on the JPL team had raised concerns about anomalies in the data, but their warnings were dismissed because they weren't submitted through proper formal channels. As the probe approached Mars in September 1999, the mission plan called for it to enter orbit at a safe altitude of 22.6 kilometers, 34 hours before arrival. The predicted altitude had dropped to a perilous 11-ton-2. A final, fatal decision was made not to perform an emergency correction maneuver. On September 23, the orbiter began its final burn. Post-failure analysis revealed the horrifying truth. Its actual trajectory took it within just 57 kilometers of the Martian surface, far below the minimum survivable altitude, where it was instantly and violently destroyed. As one NASA administrator stated, the problem here was not the error, it was the failure of NASA's checks and balances to detect the error. The price for the mistakes above was just dollars or embarrassment, but every single screw-up coming next was paid for in human lives. Tier 2, below the surface, consequential leadership and command failures. The Chernobyl Disaster recklessness. April 26, 1986. The Chernobyl disaster stands as the most catastrophic nuclear accident in history, born from a safety test that was anything but. The test was supervised by Anatoly Dyatlov, the deputy chief engineer, a man known for his authoritarian and unforgiving management style, creating a culture of fear that would prove fatal. The test was delayed for hours, pushing it into the early morning and onto a less experienced night shift, who hadn't been properly briefed. During a shift changeover, a critical error caused the reactor's power to plummet to almost nothing. Safety protocols dictated an immediate shutdown. Dyatlov, however, refused to abort, threatening the young reactor engineer into raising the power. To overcome the reactor's stalled state, the operators committed a series of grave violations, manually withdrawing a dangerous number of control rods and disabling critical automatic safety systems. These reckless actions were compounded by a catastrophic, undisclosed design flaw in the Soviet-made RBMK reactor. Its graphite-tipped control rods, meant to shut the reaction down, would momentarily and catastrophically increase the reaction rate upon initial insertion. At 1:23:40 a.m., the emergency shutdown button was pressed. This triggered the flaw. Within seconds, 2 massive explosions blew the 2,000-ton lid off the reactor, ejecting fragments of the core into the atmosphere. The ripple effect was a profound moral failure. In the immediate aftermath, Dyatlov and other senior personnel refused to believe the reactor had been destroyed. The Soviet government's response was defined by secrecy and a cover-up. They told the residents of the nearby city of Pripyat nothing, and the evacuation did not begin for 36 hours. Meanwhile, a lethal invisible cloud containing 400 times more radiation than the Hiroshima bomb was drifting across Europe. In a haunting scene, residents gathered on a railway bridge, later nicknamed the Bridge of Death, to watch the beautiful shimmering colors of the reactor fire, unaware they were being showered in deadly fallout. The disaster was a wound on the planet born of arrogance, recklessness, and lies that will remain for thousands of years. The Space Shuttle Challenger disaster pressure. The Challenger disaster was not the result of a single failure, but the culmination of a flawed organizational culture that sociologist Diane Vaughan termed the normalization of deviance. NASA and its contractor Morton Thiokol knew for years that the design of the O-rings sealing the solid rocket boosters was potentially catastrophic. After several flights experienced O-ring erosion without disaster, the problem, officially designated as having the potential to destroy the vehicle and kill the crew, was slowly recategorized in the minds of managers as an acceptable flight risk. The situation came to a head on the eve of the high-profile launch of STS-51L, carrying Krista McAuliffe, the first teacher in space. An uncharacteristic cold snap had hit Florida, and temperatures were freezing. Engineers at Morton Thiokol, particularly Roger Boisjoli, were in a panic, knowing from tests that the cold would make the O-rings stiff and unable to seal properly. On a tense teleconference, they presented their data and unequivocally recommended not to launch. The recommendation was met with intense resistance from NASA officials, who were under immense pressure to maintain an ambitious flight schedule. A frustrated NASA manager, Larry Malloy, famously snapped, "My God, Thiokol, when do you want me to launch?" Next April, this pressure proved decisive. A senior Thiokol executive told his lead engineer to take off his engineering hat and put on his management. The four senior executives present overruled their own engineers and reversed their position, recommending the launch proceed. 73 seconds after liftoff, the engineers' worst fears were realized. The cold O-rings failed to seal. A jet of flame burst from the right booster and burned through the external fuel tank, and the shuttle was torn apart in a horrifying cloud of smoke, killing all 7 crew members. The tragedy underscored the fact that when expert advice is overruled due to schedule pressure, the price is paid in human lives. The Therax 25 Software Bug Trust. In the 1980s, the Therac 25 was a revolutionary radiation therapy machine, hailed for its reliance on software for safety controls, a departure from older models that used robust hardware interlocks. Deep within its programming was a deadly flaw known as a race condition, a bug where the outcome depends on the timing of uncontrollable events. The bug would only manifest if a skilled operator familiar with the machine typed in the treatment parameters very quickly, specifically if they selected the high-power X-ray mode and then within an 8-second window quickly edited the entry to the low-power electron mode and started the treatment. The machine's brain would glitch. It would fire the concentrated high-intensity electron beam directly into the patient without the protective X-ray target in place to diffuse it, a dose 100 times stronger than intended. When this catastrophic overdose occurred, the machine would shut down, displaying a cryptic error message, malfunction 54, for which the user manual provided no explanation. Operators would often simply override the error and, in some cases, deliver a second massive overdose. The software left no detailed log, effectively erasing the evidence of its own violence. Between 1985 and 1987, at least 6 such accidents occurred, resulting in multiple deaths and severe injuries. Patients reported hearing a buzzing sound and feeling an intense burning sensation like an intense electric shock. For months, the manufacturer, ACL, insisted that an overdose was impossible and that their machine was flawless. It was only after a hospital physicist painstakingly worked with an operator to recreate the exact, rapid sequence of keystrokes that the bug was finally reproduced. The Therac 25 incidents became a landmark case study in software engineering and medical ethics, a terrifying parable about the dangers of replacing robust hardware safety systems with poorly understood and inadequately tested code, turning a machine of healing into an instrument of torture. The misunderstood word in the atomic bomb, ambiguity. In late July 1945, the Allied powers issued the Potsdam Declaration, a formal ultimatum to the Empire of Japan: surrender unconditionally or face prompt and utter destruction, a thinly veiled threat of the atomic bomb. In Tokyo, the Japanese government was perilously divided. A peace-seeking faction was seeking a negotiated end, while a fanatical military leadership demanded outright rejection. Caught in this political vice, Prime Minister Kantaro Suzuki stated at a press conference that his government was withholding comment, using a single, carefully chosen word, mokusatsu, mokusatsu. The word is one of fatal ambiguity. It can be interpreted neutrally as to take no notice of, or to withhold comment, the meaning Suzuki likely intended. However, it also carries a much harsher meaning, to treat with silent contempt. The fatal error occurred in the translation. International news agencies, including Japan's own, seized upon the more dismissive interpretation. The translation transmitted to the world was that the Japanese government was treating the ultimatum with silent contempt and that it was not worthy of comment. To the American leadership, this sounded like a categorical and arrogant rejection of the path to peace. The nuance of Suzuki's political tightrope walk was completely lost. The perception was that Japan had chosen to continue the fight. The consequences were swift and catastrophic. 10 days after the Osatsu statement, on August 6, 1945, the Enola Gay dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima. While historians agree the word was not literally mistranslated, the incident highlights a profound failure in diplomatic communication, where an ambiguous word chosen to manage a domestic crisis became the final diplomatic breakdown that pushed the world into the atomic age. A wrong decision can kill millions. But what if the mistake is the entire system? We continue our descent. Tier 3, the Deep Sea, systemic errors that change society. The Opium Wars greed. In the early 19th century, the British Empire had an embarrassing trade problem. They were addicted to Chinese tea, silk, and porcelain, creating a one-way flow of commerce that was draining Britain's silver reserves. To fix this imbalance, the British East India Company, a private corporation with its own army, devised a perfectly evil solution: opium. They began growing it on an industrial scale in British-controlled India and established a sophisticated smuggling network to flood the Chinese market with the drug. It was state-sponsored narco-trafficking on an unprecedented scale, a strategy designed to create a nation of millions of addicts who would pay for the drug with silver, thus reversing the flow of currency. When the Chinese emperor appointed Commissioner Lin Zexu to end the trade, Lin took decisive action demanding that foreign merchants surrender their entire stock of opium. He blockaded them in their warehouses until they complied, ultimately destroying over 20,000 chests of the drug by dissolving it in trenches and flushing it into the sea. The British, outrageously framing this destruction of illegal narcotics as a destruction of private property and an insult to their national honor, used the incident as a pretext for war. The First Opium War, 1839-1842, was a brutally lopsided conflict. The technologically superior British Royal Navy dismantled China's coastal defenses, forcing the Qing government to sign the Treaty of Nanking, the first of the unequal treaties. The terms were crippling. China was compelled to pay a massive indemnity, cede the island of Hong Kong to Britain, and open 5 treaty ports to foreign trade. This systemic error, the decision by an empire to balance its budget with narcotics and protect that trade with gunboats, began a century of humiliation for a great civilization and wrote one of the dirtiest chapters in modern history. The Rwandan genocide's ID cards labels. In 1994, between 800,000 and 1 million people in Rwanda were slaughtered in 100 days. The root cause of this explosion of hate can be traced back decades to a simple, laminated piece of paper, the Belgian colonial identity card. Before the Belgians arrived, Hutu and Tutsi were more like fluid social classes than distinct ethnic groups. A Hutu who acquired wealth could become a Tutsi, but the Belgian colonial administrators, obsessed with categorization and armed with the racist pseudoscience of 19th century Europe, decided the minority Tutsi were a superior race destined to rule. The most fatal step came in 1932, 1933, when the Belgians conducted a census and began issuing mandatory national ID cards that permanently and officially labeled every individual as Hutu, Tutsi, or Twa. This administrative act transformed a flexible social hierarchy into a rigid, inescapable racial caste system. When Rwanda gained independence, this system of identification was retained by the new Hutu-led governments and repurposed as a tool of oppression. In 1994, Hutu extremists seized control and unleashed a meticulously planned genocide. Their single most effective tool for identifying victims at roadblocks across the country was the mandatory national ID card. The one word printed on it determined if you lived or died. If the card said Tutsi, it was an immediate death sentence. A colonial administrative error, a label created for convenience, became the bureaucratic engine of a genocide. American Prohibition purity? In 1920, the United States embarked on a noble experiment, banning alcohol to create a healthier, more virtuous nation, free from poverty, crime, and domestic abuse. It was the culmination of a decades-long moral crusade fueled by religious fundamentalists and social reformers. They were catastrophically, comically wrong. The law didn't stop people from drinking. It just drove the entire multi-billion-dollar industry underground. This legal vacuum created something far worse than drunkenness. It created the modern American Mafia. This systemic mistake transformed small-time ethnic gangs into powerful, highly organized criminal syndicates that required sophisticated organization to manage production, smuggling, and distribution. Men like Al Capone in Chicago built vast criminal empires on the massive profits from illegal booze, using that money to corrupt the system from the inside out. The violence wasn't just bar fights. It was gangsters mowing each other down with machine guns in the streets, as in the infamous St. Valentine's Day Massacre. This attempt to legislate purity didn't make America cleaner. It professionalized vice, creating monsters far more terrifying than the ones it had sought to destroy. By 1933, the government shamefully repealed prohibition, admitting the total failure of its noble experiment. China's Four Pests campaign ecology. In 1958, as part of Mao Zedong's Great Leap Forward, a nationwide campaign was launched to eliminate four pests: rats, flies, mosquitoes, and sparrows. The logic for sparrows seemed simple. They eat grain, so killing them will increase harvests. What followed was a people's war against nature. Hundreds of millions of people banged pots and pans for hours, preventing the birds from landing until they dropped dead from sheer exhaustion. The campaign was brutally effective. The Eurasian tree sparrow was nearly eradicated in China. And then, the ecosystem collapsed. The architects of the campaign had made a breathtakingly arrogant ecological miscalculation. They had failed to understand that sparrows also eat a huge number of insects, especially locusts. With their primary natural predator gone, the locust population exploded into swarms of biblical proportions, devouring crops on a scale the sparrows never could have. This ecological disaster became a major contributing factor to the Great Chinese Famine, a 3-year nightmare from 1959 to 1961, where an estimated 15 to 55 million people starved to death. A war intended to save grain ended up destroying it, a horrifying lesson in the complex interconnected web of nature. The previous mistakes, no matter how bad, at least we can still see, but at the very bottom of the iceberg are hidden the fundamental mistakes we don't even realize. They are the source code of our world. Tier 4, the abyss. Foundational invisible errors. The inventions of Thomas Midgley Jr. Genius. In the Hall of Fame for environmental disasters, one man's name should be in giant flashing letters. But in his lifetime, Thomas Midgley Jr. was celebrated as a hero of innovation, a genius who solved some of the biggest problems of the industrial age. His two most famous inventions nearly destroyed the planet's life support system. Mistake 1: leaded gasoline. In the 1920s, to solve engine knocking, Midgley discovered a perfect anti-knock additive, tetraethyl lead, TL. The extreme toxicity of lead was already well known, with workers at prototype plants going insane and dying from what was dubbed loony gas. To quell public fears, Midgley held a press conference where he poured TL over his hands and inhaled its fumes for 60 seconds, declaring he could do so every day without harm. He was lying. For the next several decades, vehicles across the globe pumped millions of tons of neurotoxic lead into the atmosphere, causing a significant drop in the average IQ of entire populations worldwide. Mistakes 2: Freon. In the 1930s, Midgley solved the problem of toxic refrigerator coolants by inventing chlorofluorocarbons, CFCs. It was a miracle chemical, non-toxic, non-flammable, and incredibly stable. That stability was its hidden curse. Because CFCs don't break down, they drift for decades up to the stratosphere, where they are broken apart by the sun's UV radiation, releasing chlorine atoms. A single one of these atoms acts as a catalyst, destroying up to 100,000 molecules of ozone, the gas that forms a protective layer shielding the Earth from harmful radiation. He single-handedly invented the chemical mechanism responsible for the hole in the ozone layer. No single person in history has had a more destructive impact on the atmosphere. His legacy is a terrifying parable of good intentions, paving a road to environmental hell. The Scramble for Africa Straight Lines. Open a modern map of Africa, and you'll notice something unnatural. Many borders are perfectly straight, as if drawn with a ruler. They were. In the winter of 1884, diplomats from 14 European nations and the U.S. met at the Berlin Conference to civilly carve up the entire continent of Africa for themselves, like a giant pie. No Africans were invited to this meeting about the fate of Africa. On a crude, largely blank map, they took out their pencils and rulers and began drawing lines, paying no attention to the thousands of distinct ethnic groups, ancient kingdoms, or natural geographic boundaries that had defined African societies for centuries. This profoundly arrogant act of map-making committed two fundamental acts of political violence. First, it sliced through the middle of cohesive ethnic groups, splitting communities between new colonial territories. Second, it forced ancient rival tribes into the same artificially created country, laying the groundwork for future internal conflict. When the European powers decolonized Africa in the 20th century, they left behind a continent of dysfunctional states with nonsensical borders. Many of the brutal civil wars, ethnic conflicts, and political instabilities that have plagued post-colonial Africa for the last 60 years can be traced directly back to those straight lines drawn on a map in a room in Berlin. An act of profound ignorance whose violent consequences continue to reverberate across the continent today. The destruction of the Library of Alexandria. Blankness. The disappearance of the Great Library of Alexandria was the single greatest data loss in human history. Founded around 280 BC, it was the intellectual heart of the ancient world, humanity's most ambitious attempt to gather all of the world's knowledge under one roof. At its peak, it held up to 700,000 papyrus scrolls containing a vast portion of the literature, history, and science of ancient civilizations. Its destruction wasn't a single dramatic fire, but a slow, agonizing death over several centuries, a death by 1,000 cuts from warfare, political purges, declining patronage, and religious fanaticism. The first blow came in 48 BC, when Julius Caesar's forces accidentally burned a warehouse containing some of its scrolls. Later, Roman emperors purged intellectuals from the city, leading to a brain drain and dwindling funding. The final violent end came in 391 AD, when a mob led by the fanatical Bishop of Alexandria, empowered by an imperial decree to demolish pagan temples, destroyed the library's last remnant, the Serapeum. The cost of the slow erasure is incalculable. We may have lost the writings of Aristarchus of Samos, who proposed a sun-centered solar system 1,800 years before Copernicus. We may have lost blueprints from Hero of Alexandria for a primitive steam engine that could have sparked an industrial revolution in the Roman Empire. The loss may have set back the progress of science and technology by a millennium. We will never truly know what we have forgotten. The Eugenics movement. Purity. The horrifying racial policies of Nazi Germany did not spring from a vacuum. Their intellectual foundations were laid in the respectable academic halls of Western universities. The idea was called eugenics, the belief that the human race could be improved through selective breeding, like livestock, promoted as a progressive scientific solution to society's ills. It was championed by leading figures like President Theodore Roosevelt. Its fatal mistake was the belief that complex social problems like poverty and crime were simple, hereditary traits that could be bred out of the population by preventing the unfit from reproducing. This quickly turned dark. Starting in 1907, 32 U.S. states passed laws allowing for the compulsory sterilization of those deemed genetically unfit. Over the following decades, more than 60,000 American citizens, the poor, the mentally ill, immigrants, and minorities were robbed of their fundamental right to have children by the state. In 1927, the U.S. Supreme Court upheld this in the infamous case of Buck v. Bell. Writing for the majority, Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. declared, "It is better for all the world society can prevent those who are manifestly unfit from continuing their kind. 3 generations of imbeciles are enough." The most horrifying consequence was its direct influence on the Nazi regime in Germany. Adolf Hitler praised American eugenics policies in Mein Kampf. After coming to power, the Nazis established a close intellectual exchange with their American counterparts and explicitly studied and admired American eugenics laws. Their 1933 law for the prevention of hereditarily diseased offspring was modeled directly on American prototypes. This perversion of science into a tool of state-sponsored prejudice provided the intellectual and scientific justification for the next horrific step, the Holocaust. Nazi defendants at the Nuremberg trials would even cite Holmes's opinion in their own defense. This foundational error, born in the West, provided the intellectual kindling for the fires of genocide. Sometimes a small action can trigger the butterfly effect hidden by human error. I'm eager to know what problems may be happening now. So please leave a message to share your thoughts.